Hey, I'm Adam Fortuna, and I'm going to be talking about building a social network with Hasura and Ruby on Rails. We've been using these two technologies to build a social network for about the last 2 years, and we have really loved how we've been able to emphasize the good parts of both of these to work even faster with them together than we could work with them apart. So, we're going to be going through some features that we use on Hardcover, kind of normal social network kind of features, and kind of talk through how we chose that and how we build on that with these two technologies. So, you've no doubt seen something like this on just about every social network out there. And if you were to implement something like this purely in Hasura and a front end, you would quickly run into some problems. For one, just updating this likes count is not something you want an end user to be able to do. But aside from that, there's other things like notifying the user that their activity was liked, sending out emails, maybe caching something on the front end based on this. All of this business logic needs to live somewhere. And we found that putting this all on the Rails side to be our best bet. Here's a bit about how our architecture looks and how Rails fits into that. So we have this front end that's all Next.js. This is just running on Vercel, regular old Next.js app. For the most part, anytime we need to fetch data, we're making GraphQL requests to Hasura, which then fetches everything from Postgres. And if you're not logged into the site, all of the things that you will see on the site go through this flow. It doesn't use Rails at all. It's only when you have a logged in user and you're performing some actions, that's when we need to do something more than just basic fetching and maybe some basic mutations. In this case, we use Hasura Actions to connect with a REST API on the Rails side. And this has really allowed us to build up our business logic all in one place on the Rails side, while letting Hasura focus on being an API for the next side. So if you haven't used Hasura Actions before, that's kind of going to be the focus of this talk, how we use Hasura to talk to Rails. And you might be wondering, why not just use Postgres for all this and put more logic in the database itself? We started doing that and it became unmaintainable very, very fast. It was also very difficult to debug and version. So we quickly moved away and put all of our business logic in Rails. Our repo looks pretty much like this. There's a folder for Next.js, a folder for Hasura, and a folder for Rails. And we just use Docker to run all of these locally. Hasura also has the ability to deploy when you push to a branch. So by pushing to our production branch, we trigger a deploy to Hasura, we trigger a deploy to Vercel, and we trigger a deploy to Heroku, which hosts our Rails side. So git push production, and it deploys 3 sites at once. So for this feature of liking something on the site, we use a Hasura action, which you can check out the Hasura admin and go and create an action. And when you create an action, you give it a description, but then you also give it the actual string that will be used to call it from GraphQL. In this case, upsert like or delete like. From there, the next configuration is deciding where that action goes. In this case, we're using Rails app URL, which is a variable that was passed in to Hasura. And what's really nice about this is that our local environment using Docker and our production environment hosted in Hasura Cloud, we're just able to set this app URL to different URLs, and it works the same locally or on production. We're passing through the client headers. That way the Rails side can know who the current user is. And we're adding this Rails API key environment variable that you could think of kind of like a secret handshake between Hasura and Rails. That way, if a request comes through without this key, we can just say it's an invalid request. And in this case, we only want this upsert like to be done by logged in users, so we can set that on the Hasura side. Over on the Rails side, we use RESTful controllers for handling all of the actions that come from Hasura. We just add a namespace for this and then regular old Rails controllers with create and destroy actions. Now, this is a lot of Rails code, but the big things to consider here are we're getting the input from Hasura that was passed to the mutation right here. So we're able to find out what was liked and the ID of it. This allows us to like a review with an ID, an activity with an ID, a list with an ID, and have it behave the same independent of the type of thing that was liked. And when someone calls the upsert like action, it's going to run this top one, this create part. And that's what's going to actually create the like and then return the likes count. You'll notice here, we're also getting the current user. And we're able to do that from the Hasura base controller, where we're able to then look up the current user based on the session variables that Hasura is passing over. So remember, this came from a front-end request from Next.js that's going straight to Hasura, and then it's going from there to Rails. And yet on the Rails side, we still know who the user is. We're also able to prevent any access to these APIs unless you pass in this secret handshake key. This destroy part is a little bit different though. When it comes to Ruby on Rails, RESTful controllers are HTTP verb based. So to do the create action, you're posting to a URL. To do the destroy action, you're using the HTTP delete verb on a different URL. So let's take a look at how we change the HTTP verb on the Hasura side. So this looks just like the upsert like one we looked at earlier. We're creating a mutation. We're passing in likable ID and likable type. We're going to a URL on the Rails side. And you'll notice it doesn't have /ID at the end of that URL. Now, the way we manage this with Hasura is by configuring the REST connectors and setting this to use a delete verb. And in addition to that, we can also set additional parts of the URL that are changed based on the inputs. So this took me a little while to understand exactly what was going on, but you can see the body.input, that contains whatever was passed into the mutation initially. So body.input.likableType was one of the direct inputs to this mutation. For something like deleting a list, we might just pass that input.id, and then on the Rails side, we would, based on that. In this case, we have a composite key of type and ID. So instead, we're just kind of passing them both. But we don't really need to since we're able to get it all from the input anyways. Now, this might seem like a lot of endpoints. This is every endpoint after 2 years of development. And for the most part, all these are exactly what I showed you. They are kind of forwarding a request from Hasura to Rails and then returning a very basic response. We found that on the Rails side, we want to return as little as possible, usually just the ID of what was changed. And then on the Hasura side, we relate that ID back to another entity in the database where we can return it. So these endpoints are usually only returning just the ID of what was changed, or optionally something that represents what was changed if it was a delete where there's no longer an ID to look up. Here's kind of a recap of what that looks like from beginning to end. On the Next.js side, we make an upsert-like GraphQL request to Hasura. Hasura changes that to a post action to Hasura/likes on the Rails side, which calls the create action in Rails. That creates the like, it notifies the user, it updates the likes count, and then it returns that likes count all the way back to the Next.js side. One of the big things for me as I was going through learning like what goes in Hasura, what goes in Rails, was trying to figure out where that line is between these two. And I think for us, it's been if we're able to read from the database directly, just put it in Hasura. Never even worry about Rails. Sometimes that means creating functions that hit our database directly. But for the most part, we've just been able to use regular old access through Hasura to our database. Likewise, for mutations, if we're only changing a field that has no side effects, we'll still use Hasura to update or insert something. But if something has additional business logic, then we disable the ability for people to edit that table manually or edit that table through Hasura. And instead, we require them to go through Rails for those mutations. So for instance, you can't create a like using the Hasura table directly. You have to do it through this upsert like action. We also only want to do things that require a single table, updates to a single table. If we're updating multiple tables, then that needs a transaction, a database transaction. That way we can do it all in one atomic commit rather than potentially having data out of sync. So if something is using multiple tables and updating multiple tables, it goes through Rails. Here are some of our takeaways from 2 years of this. Pick one place for your database migrations. Hasura has an option to do migrations that are straight SQL. We found that putting them in Rails has been a lot easier. Rails migrations are just kind of beautiful as opposed to SQL, which can get a bit clunky. So yeah, find one place and stick with it. And likewise, if you can cache something in the database, so that way it can be accessed directly without accessing Rails, throw it in the database. Database space is cheap. For connecting between Hasura and Rails, we kept it RESTful for everything. We tried not to complicate it or overthink it. Like if it's not a RESTful route, then we'll usually find a way to make it into a RESTful route. And you want to protect the Rails API from someone accessing it directly and maybe causing some damage. On the Hasura side, we have loved having one API for our entire app that handles authorization, authentication. It's one that our mobile app can use, our website can use, and we've been able to give access to this API to our users. We want to have this kind of be an adapter to our other APIs. So for instance, we talked today about using Rails as one of those adapters, but we also use this to connect with our CRM to get like our newsletter, for instance. We use Hasura very much for permissions as well. So everything is authorized by what the current user can access down to the row level in the table. And we don't have to worry about that on Rails side, which has saved us a ton of time. And having this export has allowed us to use the Hasura admin to create these actions, to set up things in the Hasura admin. And then we just run an export, save those files in Git, and then deploy. It's made for a very easy flow for development. So that's a little bit about how we're using Hasura and Rails together at Hardcover. Thanks for listening and watching. If you want to get in touch, check me out at adamfortuna.com, on Mastodon at ruby.social, or check out Hardcover and let me know what you think. Thanks a lot.